In 1944, Germany was exhausted. 5 years of war never stopped consuming. Soldiers were dying in Russia. German cities were being bombed regularly by American and British planes. Factories operated day and night to replace equipment that was being destroyed faster than it could be made. Morale was falling, and Hitler knew this. There was one thing that kept the dictator awake at night: the fear of an amphibious invasion. If the Allies managed to land successfully on European soil, Germany would be squeezed between two impossible enemies: Russia from the east, Allies from the west. Game over. So in 1943, Hitler ordered something ambitious and desperate: build the Atlantic Wall, a line of defense along the entire French coast from Brittany to the Netherlands that would be so strong, so deep, so impenetrable that no enemy could get through. The construction was frantic. Millions of men worked under obsessive pressure: German soldiers, French civilians forced to work, prisoners, day after day, month after month, concrete bunkers being poured, twisted steel fences erected, entire fields being mined with explosives, anti-tank obstacles placed strategically, machine gun positions, obstacles in the water to destroy landing craft. It wasn't just a line of defense, it was a fortress. Hitler looked at maps and visualized his enemies trying to land and being cut down on the beach. He called it his perfect defense system. Generals visited and agreed, at least publicly. It was impossible. No one could get through this. But there were problems that nobody admitted out loud. First, the generals disagreed about where the attack would really come from. Pas-de-Calais, the closest point to Great Britain, Normandy, further west, Brittany even more distant. The entire defensive strategy was spread along hundreds of kilometers of coastline. Everything was too thin, everything was too shallow. Nothing had the depth that the German defense strategy truly required. Second, resources were running out. There wasn't enough concrete, there wasn't enough steel, there weren't enough men. So what was built in haste. Bunkers that should have been 10 meters deep were 5 meters deep. Minefields that should have covered kilometers covered only hundreds of meters. It was a bluff. Beautiful from a distance, fragile up close. Third, and this nobody knew, the Allies already knew every detail. Espionage, aerial reconnaissance, pilots who photographed every bunker. The Atlantic Wall wasn't a secret. It was a symbol that could be studied, analyzed, its weaknesses identified long before any attack. In the spring of 1944, German soldiers were positioned along the coast. Many were veterans who had survived years of combat, but many were boys, recruits, men who had been wounded and reassembled, men who were too tired to be afraid. They dug trenches, they put up barbed wire, they practiced what to do if enemy or tanks arrived. Nobody knew when, everyone suspected soon. But there was a sense of unreality. Everything was too prepared, too organized. Surely the Allies couldn't really get through this. On the night of June 5th, 1944, German soldiers in Normandy bunkers slept. Some ate cold soup, others wrote letters home that would never be sent. Officers went to their quarters. Generals in their headquarters were confident. Weather forecast indicated a storm. No enemy commander would be crazy enough to land in a storm. Everything was in place. Every defense was ready. The Atlantic Wall watched over the French coast like a sleeping guardian, completely unaware that in just a few hours, everything it represented would be tested and proven to be an illusion. The dawn of June 6, 1944, began with noise that nobody had imagined possible. First, the sound of planes, hundreds of them, thousands, then the noise of anti-aircraft fire, then explosions, many explosions. Entire bunkers shook. German soldiers woke up confused. Was this a drill? No, this was real. Paratroopers began to fall, thousands of men descending in parachutes over Normandy in the darkness. Some were shot while falling, some landed in swamps and drowned, some landed in trees, but there were so many that many managed to reach the ground alive, and when they arrived, they began to fight. German soldiers in their bunkers began to fire, machine guns shooting, artillery being fired. The bunkers had a clear advantage. They were elevated, protected, well positioned. But there was a fundamental problem that nobody had adequately considered during all the construction. The bunkers were too high. They could fire far out over the perfect ocean, but to fire down on the nearby beach against troops who had already landed, it was difficult, almost impossible to adjust angles low enough. And then the warships began. 6,000 ships approaching the coast, some small, many enormous. British and American warships began to bombard the coastline. The Atlantic Wall that had cost so much in labor and resources was being destroyed. Bunkers received direct hits and disappeared. Weapon positions were obliterated. Steel fences that had taken months to put up were destroyed in minutes. 150,000 Allied soldiers landed on the first day. The beaches of Normandy were filling with men. Some were killed immediately, but there were so many that even with heavy losses there was no way to stop them. They were waves, wave after wave. Some managed to reach the defenses, some penetrated. The Atlantic Wall was being breached. This was impossible, but it was happening. The deepest chaos took over German command. Hitler was sleeping. When he woke up, the generals had to tell him. An invasion in Normandy. Hitler responded, "No, this is a trick. The real attack will be at Pas-de-Calais." The Germans had been completely deceived. The Allies, through sophisticated disinformation operations, convinced Germany that the real landing would be in a completely different place. So Germany kept its best troops waiting there while Normandy was being invaded. Generals in Normandy asked for authorization to move reserve tanks from the interior to the coast, reinforcements, everything they could to contain this. But the orders didn't arrive, or they arrived too late, or they arrived contradictory. Precious hours were lost in bureaucratic hesitation, hours during which Allied positions solidified, hours that would never return. Young German soldiers on the beach and in the bunkers discovered a horrible truth that day. All the propaganda, all the confidence, every promise that the Atlantic Wall was impenetrable was a lie. They were being outnumbered, outgunned in firepower. Their commanders seemed confused. Their reinforcements weren't coming. And they were alone, completely alone, holding a line that was crumbling. A captured German soldier would later describe this as the beginning of the end. Not just of the battle, of the end of the war, of Germany, of everything they believed they were fighting for. On that day, on June 6, 1944, every German soldier in Normandy knew, even if they didn't say it out loud, that they had lost. Everything that would follow would be just months of slow defeat. After June 6th, Normandy became a slow hell, weeks of combat, not great battles as Germany had imagined, street-to-street fighting, village-to-village fighting. German soldiers fighting for every meter of ground as they had been ordered. Fight to the end, don't retreat. The Führer was watching. The regime demanded absolute loyalty, but absolute loyalty meant slow death. German soldiers in Normandy experienced months of horror without drama. There were no great offensives. There was only continuous fighting, continuous exhaustion, continuous death. Their rifle had diminishing ammunition. Their food was rationed and usually cold. Their friend beside them yesterday was now dead, buried in a quick hole. There's another friend behind him, nervous, waiting for his turn. A 19-year-old soldier who had been recruited only months before would later describe how he and his colleagues dug trenches in the mud of Normandy during the rain, knowing they would probably die there, not gloriously, not with noble purpose. They just died because Germany had no way to win and couldn't accept this. The German strategy was one of human cost. There was no brilliant maneuver strategy. There was no intelligent tactical withdrawal. There was only fight here, die here, and let's hope the next soldier arrives to do the same. There weren't enough next soldiers. There weren't adequate reinforcements. There was no hope. At home, in Germany, families received telegrams. Your son fell in Normandy. Your husband was killed in action. Your brother disappeared in combat. The telegrams arrived in waves. Entire cities had only mourning. Groups of widowed women. Mothers who had lost all their sons. Children who would never know their fathers. A pain that had no name. And this wasn't just Normandy. While this was happening in the West, in Russia, the war continued. German soldiers were dying by the thousands every month. Italy was lost. The Allies were bombing German cities. Cities that had existed for centuries were destroyed in one night. Dresden, Hamburg, Cologne, Berlin. British bombers at night, American bombers by day. There was no rest. French civilians in Normandy also suffered. Allied bombings destroyed villages where people had lived for generations. Houses were crushed. Entire families died in basements. The German occupation that had lasted years was ending in chaos, conflict, death, and retribution. There was no safety. There was no safe place. Collaborators were discovered. Germans were captured. French people who had helped the Germans were judged. German soldiers trapped between loyalty to the regime and the obvious truth that everyone knew. This was defeat. Not eventual victory. Not brilliant strategy that would turn everything around. Defeat. Complete, total, inevitable. And it would cost everything. It would cost their lives. It would cost their cities. It would cost their country. Normandy wasn't a battle. It was the breaking point of the world. The weeks turned into months, the months into years. Germany was slowly pushed back. There was no honorable retreat. There was retreat under fire. German soldiers who survived Normandy fought later in Caen, then in Falaise. Then they tried to reorganize. Some desperate counter-offensives. Nothing worked. By September, the Allies had already liberated France. Germany reached for hope. Maybe the Western defenses could hold for a while. Maybe they could maintain a line at the border and let the war drag on. Maybe, and this was only hope, maybe they could negotiate peace. Maybe it wasn't the end. But in December of 1944, Germany launched one last desperate offensive, the Battle of the Bulge. They concentrated everything they had left. Tanks, soldiers, hope. It lasted weeks. It didn't work. The offensive was repelled. After that, there were no more offensives. There was only increasingly weak defense. 1945. Germany was being invaded, not just threatened from borders, invaded. Soviet soldiers from the east, American, British, Canadian soldiers from the west, and there was nothing between them and Berlin. German cities were becoming battlefields. Cities that had existed for centuries, where people had normal lives, normal homes, normal families. Everything was turned into smoking ruins. German families fled with what they could carry. Mothers with children, the elderly, everything they owned. Roads full of refugees, empty cities or destroyed cities. There was no safe place. Allied planes attacked roads. Artillery fired at cities. German soldiers, many of them who had survived, Normandy, now fought on their own homeland soil, hoping that something would change, knowing that nothing would change. Hitler never admitted defeat, never surrendered, never ordered strategic withdrawal. Always fight, fight to the end. The end meant complete destruction. In May of 1945, less than a year after D-Day, everything ended. Germany surrendered unconditionally. cities occupied, country partitioned, leadership executed or fugitive. This was the end. The numbers are difficult to absorb. 7 million German soldiers died during the entire Second World War. 2 million just during the 11 months after D-Day. Entire cities rebuilt. An entire generation of men lost. Families that would never recover from grief. A nation that would take decades to reassemble. For German soldiers who experienced D-Day, life after the war was a life of permanent trauma. Some were prisoners of war for years. Some returned to homes that no longer existed. Some discovered that their entire family had been killed. Some could never talk about it. Some could never stop talking about it. Nightmares for the rest of their lives. The German perspective of D-Day is not a story of villains receiving just defeat. It's a story of ordinary people, very ordinary, trapped in a war machine that had promised everything and delivered only suffering, soldiers who believed in promises that would never be fulfilled, civilians who were left with permanent scars, an entire country that learned in a terrible way that illusion doesn't win a war that is already lost. Normandy wasn't just a battle. It wasn't just a turning point of the war. It was the moment when everyone, soldiers on the beach, generals in headquarters, even Hitler in his bunker, knew with certainty that there was no longer a path to victory, only the long, slow path to total defeat. And that defeat would last not months but years. And the price would be not just a battle, it would be a country, it would be a generation, it would be everything.